I worked mostly in financial services for 21 years,
Very
um,
good.
in team lead for the most part. And then I was one of those people who was made redundant. It was following the recession 15 years ago. And at the time, it felt like the worst thing that could have happened to me. Looking back, now all I see is the massive opportunity it gave me because it gave me the chance to retrain. While I was quite successful in my career at that point, it wasn't really in line with my values or what I wanted to do with my life. So I trained as a psychotherapist and haven't stopped studying since. I've studied psychotherapy, psychology, equality law, diversity and inclusion, and I suppose justice, social justice issues and sociology. And I now work with companies helping people have better mental health in business, avoid burnout, and have more inclusive practices at work.
That's a very good answer. And we'll talk about some of those issues later in this interview. But taking it back prior to your professional career, what was Gillian Fagan like as a child?
I was a very good girl. I was the oldest grandchild on both sides of the family. So I was adored as a child, being the firstborn on both sides. I was very blessed in that I had four grandparents who I remember very well. And I was a very happy kid. We grew up, though, in quite an impoverished socioeconomic status. We lived with my grandmother until I was about 2 or 3, and then moved into a council estate in Finglas. So we lived there until I was about 12, and then my parents moved to the Navan Road, where they still live. But I didn't know any different. That was my world, and I was very happy. I just have childhood memories of being out playing with my bike on the streets in the 80s and swapping fancy papers with neighbours. And in school, I really enjoyed school in primary school. Secondary school was a bit more of a challenge for me. The overwhelm of so many different classes, so many different people. It was only much later in life that I got diagnosed with autism, and now looking back on my struggle with certain transitions, things made so much more sense. But my childhood was, I suppose, typical of your 1980s sort of childhood. And then my siblings came along, and that's a different story.
Indeed, and there wasn't very much money in Ireland during the 1980s. My memory of the 1980s was huge, long unemployment queues, people signing on at the labour exchange, getting their dole each week, a time of mass unemployment. A lot of companies were exiting the country, high taxation also, and immigration, of course. Many people who graduated from university or did their leaving cert got the boat to England or headed off to Australia or the States in search of a career. And many of those people have returned, but many haven't. They're still working abroad and never probably will return. Talking about your diagnosis there of autism, when were you diagnosed, and was it a relief to you in the end to get that diagnosis?
It was. I remember probably 2005, 2006, there was a TV show, maybe TV3 or RTE, on autism. And I remember seeing it and saying to my friend, I've a lot of those traits. And she said to me, and this shows how much, I suppose, we've changed in our attitude towards these kind of things. She said, but that's the thing for boys and men. Girls don't have that. So I sort of just thought, yeah, she's right, because the show was all focused on little boys and the whole male experience. So I just dismissed it. And it was only, to be honest with you, John, it was only just over 2 years ago I got diagnosed. I worked a lot as a therapist with autistic clients, and I really saw some of my traits in my clients. Very much so, that I sort of self-diagnosed probably about 5 years ago. But when I was going back to college to do equality studies in Maynooth, I was afraid that I'd struggle with the academic side of it, and I sought professional diagnosis at that stage in case I needed any supports with the study. the psychologist that I saw was somebody who I'd met through my line of work. And she had actually thought that I had been diagnosed and knew this about myself because she recognized the traits in me. So when I initially reached out to her, she said, "Oh, sure, I thought you were diagnosed and all." So other people who were familiar with, I suppose, autism in women saw it in me and had nearly diagnosed me passively. So I saw her and did the formal process, but because she had a pre-existing experience of me, I doubted the diagnosis. So I went and got diagnosed again. I did say to my GP at the time, who had pointed out, like I was 40, and he'd pointed out that I'd managed so far, so good. Why would I want to seek a diagnosis at this stage in my life? And a lot of people had that attitude, but they didn't see behind the scenes. They just saw somebody who kept excelling through a career, but not seeing the burnout or what it cost, or me Googling what does a therapist wear, because I just don't quite understand how I was supposed to dress to do my line of work. So there were a lot of other bits and pieces, like the massive collection of books. I've given up even trying to keep my office look orderly and tidy. So when I got diagnosed, it was absolutely a huge relief, because I'd always felt different. And I suppose I justified it in every which way, but I sort of saw things other people didn't really see. My first job when I was 18, my manager had said to me, "Okay, now what do you want to do to, what skills do you want to develop?" I was there about a year, the performance review and the appraisals, and this would have been in the 90s. And I said to him, "I want to learn how to play golf." And he said, "What do you mean you want to learn how to play golf?" And so, well, it seems that to get ahead in your career in this company, you need to learn how to play golf. Not realizing at all at that stage, I was calling out a gender issue, but I thought that by learning how to play golf, that would advance my career. So I always saw things a little bit different. And it was a relief to then understand why. And I've always had this sense of equality, fairness, social justice, which I now realize is actually quite a common autistic trait. But growing up, that wouldn't have been in line with a lot of my peers, particularly in the workplace. So now I just have labels and language to help me identify who I am and why I am the way I am.
It's a very comprehensive answer, and thank you for that. Looking back at your career in financial services and in asset management, did you engage in a lot of negative self-talk or self-doubt during your career in that industry?
Yes, I think very much so. And when I look back, I was constantly living with imposter syndrome, constantly. I always felt that I wasn't good enough. And the flip side of that was that I pushed myself extra hard. So from the business perspective, I excelled, but at such a huge cost, because I'd work extra hours, I'd be doing all of the extra bits. I always exceeded targets across the board, but then I'd burn out. And I recognized it in myself. I'd see myself starting to dip. My standards weren't sustainable, but I was so afraid of failing. And the negative self-talk came from, am I doing this right? Constantly second guessing everything, and having to prove everything. And if I were to do a thing, I'd need to be 100% sure before I'd even put a suggestion forward or throw an idea out. I found through then, I've becoming self-aware has really changed how I brainstorm. I'm a lot more strategic thinking, but back then I wouldn't have had the confidence to say something unless I already knew the answer, which is a terrible way to be, because my career began way before I'd access to the internet. So even around informing myself of things to become knowledgeable on a subject before I put something forward, I just did not feel that I was good enough. And that, the negative self-talk that came from that constantly. So I was, my entire life, whether it's playing golf or doing courses, I was always then focused on personal development. And now looking back, it was because I didn't feel good enough. I didn't feel I fit in. The negative self-talk was part of what drove me to now my whole thing. One of my biggest values is personal development and curiosity, but that's come from quite a shadow place.
And when you were working in financial services, let's say you're in a meeting with a group of people, did you feel reticent to put your point forward because you might have felt you were going to say the wrong thing or people might laugh at you. So were you one of those people who kind of stayed quiet and let the other people do the talking?
Yeah, until I became self-employed. Yes, I was. For the most part, I'd sit back in meetings, especially if there were authoritative people in those meetings. Even though at one point I managed a team of 60, I'd still have been fairly quiet in senior management or executive meetings. And then through my career, when I began to attend board meetings, I just felt that I didn't understand the chit chat. It was mostly around GAA or sports, and I just didn't feel I had any value to add to the conversations. Whereas if I had the facts, then I could present that. Otherwise, with the small talk and the chit chat, for the most part, I did stay quiet, and I'd only contribute if I was asked or if I felt that I did have value to contribute.
And moving forward to that redundancy conversation, when you were told back in 2008, 2009, that your job was being made redundant, how well do you think that conversation was handled by your manager and HR?
Terribly, because I was on holiday when I got the phone call. And I had no idea if I was coming back to a job or if the job was going to be gone. Now, it took a couple of years. I was involved then in the wind down of the company. But I was on holiday and I got a phone call. And it had gone public on the news the same day, the staff were told. So the conversation for me didn't happen until I came back from holiday. But my entire holiday was spent in such an anxious state, worried about paying the mortgage, worried about where to get another job. All of my career to that point had been by my design. Anytime I went and sought change in my role, it had been by my choice. So I felt that my choice and my agency had been taken away from me. I felt completely crippled. I was so heightened in anxiety. And I also had begun to get that realization at that point that I didn't want to continue in this career. But then being made redundant, having the experience I had, it just meant that I'd had to continue in that sort of industry. Because I had no other skills or no other education to go on. When I came back into work, my colleague, my manager at that time, did talk to me. The conversation was handled very badly, but the company handled it quite well in supporting us then with interview skills and CV preparation and HR providing references and giving you the flexibility from the workspace to go and attend interviews. So pros and cons, I suppose, but because I was a week or two behind the conversations, I'd been getting messages when I was on my holiday from my team asking me, like as a team lead, I didn't get to deliver that news to my team. So it was quite devastating that they were hearing it from my manager and then coming to me with questions I couldn't answer.
Sure. To me, it sounds like a very traumatic and upsetting experience, to say the least, because you were on holidays when you were told that your job is being made redundant. And straight away you go into flight or fright mode and you start thinking about, how am I going to pay my mortgage going forward?
And also then the expense, like just how the rest of your holiday goes. Maybe I shouldn't get a dessert. I don't know what I'm coming home to. The simple things, just like spending on holiday, it changed everything.
Yeah. Moving forward, immediately post redundancy, were you left to paddle your own canoe? And when did you get that aha moment to say, I'm going to become a counsellor and psychotherapist?
When I was made redundant, I felt quite burnt out by the industry. And I knew something had to change, but I had no idea what. So I took a month without working, without doing anything, to reflect on what I really wanted to do. And it didn't come to me in this light bulb moment, I wanted to be a therapist. I actually had applied for a few different courses, part-time courses, with the intention of going back to work and studying part-time. And the course that was almost the course I signed up to was a master's in creative writing. But I missed it just by a little bit. I got into the course, but there was a niggle in my brain and it was keeping me awake at night, that I enjoyed writing, but I didn't want to put so much into a hobby and then perhaps have it not come into fruition as a career. So when I began to look at, well, what are my values? What do I enjoy doing? What gives me energy? What makes me feel the most alive? It was understanding people, understanding humanity, understanding myself, personal development, human growth, history of evolution, psychology. So I began to kind of feel that pull, and I applied to a few psychotherapy colleges and got into my first, I got into all of them, but I got my first choice, and it was a part-time course. So I, just to help, like my redundancy thankfully covered, because it's expensive training, it covered the first year. And this is the autumn. I bought every book on the book list in first year. I since learned some hacks, but I didn't necessarily need to do that. But financially, then it crippled me after 1 year of college. So I had to return to work. And I just began to temp at that stage in a secretarial role, while I giving myself that headspace to reflect on what I really wanted. And that gave me then the gradual shift in my career.
It's a great answer to a difficult question, to be quite honest. And fair play to you. You took the decision to train full-time for at least 1 year as a psychotherapist, and then you took on part-time work to fund your continued education. And that shows great dedication, great energy. So well done to you. And you've progressed greatly over the last number of years in developing your business model. Moving forward to, I suppose, it'll be a joyous event. You appeared on the Sunday Independent there on the 10th of April. There was an article about you and your business. What emotions did you experience in your own mind when you saw that article in print?
Honest, raw answer, initially, imposter syndrome. That's good old imposter syndrome. I'm very familiar with it, because I was aware that there were a few people being interviewed, and I had thought that I would be quoted in an overall article. I didn't realize I'd have a full page picture and then the article as well. So when I saw, I saw it on Twitter before I saw the paper, and initially my heart, heart rate escalated, mouth went dry. It was like, right, I need to go and get the paper and see what's being said and make sure I wasn't taken out of context. I always get very nervous about these things, just around the context of it and whether I'd be misquoted or taken out of context. But when I got it, it was okay. But it's still such a new thing. 2 years ago, I was featured in a 2 or 3 page spread in Women's Way, and that was how my family knew about my autism, because I was still processing how to communicate this with family and how to tell my parents that I'd gotten this diagnosis. And my sister-in-law rang me and said, "You're in Women's Way," and I didn't know that was going to be the case. So it's just since then, whenever there's anything going to be published, it does invoke a little bit of anxiety, and I feel then this part of the whole eldest child syndrome, this need to really mind others in the process and mind others in my family as well.
So overall, you were initially a bit tentative, but then when you read the article, you said, that's great, this is me, I'm going to get on with life and build my business and be happy.
Yeah.
And
also seeing the representation, the Sunday Independent article you're talking about, that seeing other neurodivergent people and such a positive spin, speaking of their experiences, that this is not something that's, society sees it as a disability, but people are proud to now come out and describe how they are and their experiences with it.
Great answer. Thank you for that. Your motto is collaboration over competition. Can you explain that, please?
Oh, John, there are so many charities in Ireland, so many, like thousands of charities in Ireland. And could you imagine if we were to work together for funding rather than compete with each other? And I think as well, the whole ethos of inclusion, from my perspective, when we join forces, we get much more of human rights movement. When we join forces, we're less competitive with each other. We get much more of an impact in just improving society for ourselves individually and then for society as a whole. And I just think if we have this inclusion ethos and join forces and learn from each other, It's the type of business style that I practice. I run an anti-oppressive therapy center, and it's that whole motto. And we lift each other up. It's reciprocal self-improvement. And the self then is not just the individual, but the team, the society, the community.
Very good answer. Thank you for that. Moving on to some aspects of your work, Gillian. What advice do you have for a member of the LGBTQ plus community who's experiencing isolation or loneliness?
There've been pros and cons over the last 2 years. I don't really want to thank COVID for anything, but it has made services a lot more accessible, with more and more things going online, and more services being accessible, and more community meetups happening irrespective of distance. Isolation is a huge issue in the LGBT community, because particularly in rural areas, somebody might be not connected with peers, might feel like they're the only person like that in the village. They might not know other individuals like them. There might be issues around coming out, and there's still a lot of stigma still. And even to look at what happened in Sligo recently regarding the 2 murders, there's still a lot of stigma for LGBT plus people, and a lot of inclusion issues. And I just think when we connect to a community, I really, really do believe we heal best in community. When we're tribal creatures anyway, we're wired to connect. So with people who are struggling with isolation, whether they're LGBT plus or anybody who feels different and not connected with their community, this is the one thing that is super about online. We can get a much more of that connection. But we might need to do a little bit of legwork. We might need to join things and be that only new person coming to things. I still feel that nothing kind of trumps that in-person, face-to-face connection, but sometimes I absolutely respect that's not always possible. You're not alone. There are hundreds, thousands, millions of others potentially out there like you, but the onus is on you to then reach out.
Another question for you here, Gillian, and in terms of diversity and inclusion, what type of standards would you like to see introduced here in Ireland to embrace diversity and inclusion in the workplace?
One of my biggest protocols, I guess, when I worked in the financial sector, it was starting to come in as a workplace theme. It wasn't quite reaching the agendas, but people were calling for more diversity and inclusion practices and work. At that time, the answer from HR, the answer from management, the answer from boards was to set up a committee yourselves and sort of do it on your own time, which I was involved at from the beginning. But that created this separation almost, because you had to then have meetings outside of core working hours. And this is still happening in a lot of industry, where people recruit a diversity and inclusion specialist or set up a diversity and inclusion team or a committee, or even like that, still in some organizations, committees happen outside of their core working hours. And I think to have real inclusion, this needs to be an issue for everybody. It needs to be added into individual KPIs for everybody in the business. I think this idea of putting it on the agenda, it needs to be on the agenda until it's normalized. I think there's still not enough representation in higher management or on boards. As I said, my own board experience back in that past career was going into meetings as the only woman where everybody was talking about GAA and not being able to partake in conversations. They weren't inclusive conversations. There was no consideration to the ethos of inclusion or what would be the more inclusive practices or conversation to start the meetings. And I just think if we start diversifying the people we work with, the media we consume, and the types of articles and books that we read, we then can get a different way of thinking, a different way of seeing, and an understanding of how different people operate. And I think inclusion, really it comes down to the individual, and there's a call to action for each and every person to be more inclusive and to look at what can you do to be more inclusive in your community and in your business.
Great answer. And I think what you're saying there is, it's very easy to pay lip service to diversity and inclusion, if senior management in a company or the board of directors are serious about it, it's not good enough just to set up an informal committee from staff. They have to discuss it at a board level and put together a strategy. And then it's up to senior and middle management to put that strategy into reality.
Yeah.
And that takes time and effort, and it takes open discussions. It doesn't happen overnight.
No.
What emotions did you feel when the business Under the Rainbow was awarded All-Star? It was awarded Business Foundation's All-Star status by the All-Ireland Business Foundation.
We got the Diversity and Inclusion Award for 2021, which lasts up till summer 2022. So it's it was, to be honest, we only got founded. Well, I set up the company in 2019, so the year before COVID, and I was afraid COVID would annihilate us. Ironically, it's nearly boosted us because we've been able to deliver online, therefore accessing a much wider audience. We've gone international a lot sooner than intended. Our business has been very reactive because the demand for our services is bigger than our little organization. So we're constantly expanding. We've gone from 3 when we started in March 2019. We've over 30 now, and we're still recruiting. In 3 years, that's huge tangent of acceleration. So when we got that award, we're still quite humbled by it because it's recognition of how hard we've worked. We have not stopped. I mean, that level of growth shows how hard we're working. And we incredibly pulled together as a team, pulled out all the stops to keep going in spite of COVID and make sure that our services, like immediately within a week of lockdown, we were online. We were offering therapy online. We're contacting colleges about offering non-oppressive therapy modules. We're still working with businesses. We're contracting with some international companies around long-term training and developing inclusion policies and developing inclusion strategies with business goals. So our work still feels like we're only getting started. It feels like we haven't had a chance to catch our breath. But we've recently, April, we've gone from a board of 3 to a board of 5, and we'll be expanding the board further throughout the year. So I definitely feel the team deserve every single bit of recognition because I really cannot stress how hard everybody has worked to make it happen. And we've been mostly fueled on passion for the first couple of years. Most startups, there's the whole issue around funding, and if you want to look at how our balance sheets are, it's mostly passion that's been fueling us because we really believe in this. So recognition of our hard work, the award, I'm so delighted we got it, still very humbled, and yet I do feel it's well deserved because of how hard we do work.
That's a great answer, and well done to you and your co-founders for progressing so far in such a short space of time. And it shows that you're very passionate about growing the business and helping your clients. Without going into specifics or mentioning names, you've had a lot of clients coming through your door over the past 2 years due to the COVID pandemic. What are the main issues that people are attending your clinic for? Or what do they want to talk about, may I say?
There seems to be 2 themes, and perhaps it's a reflection of the type of therapy centre that we run. The main issues, anxiety is the most common issue that we would deal with. And again, our therapy centre went from 3 therapists in June 2019 with 3 therapists. We've a huge recruitment drive with our therapists. We're currently at 27. We'll have another 2 joining us in May and more therapists coming on board throughout the year. The issue of anxiety, I think that's reflective in society with everything that's happened with COVID, the uncertainty, changing, different people have different boundaries, the anxiety over sickness and disability and health and family impact, and then people who have been in isolation. But the upside of that is it's being able to offer therapy online meant we have been able to expand again at a a much more accelerated rate than we'd initially anticipated. The second theme that we see a lot, and this is probably the reflective of the type of business that we are people who come in for therapy because of discrimination or non-inclusion. And this is particularly driven from workforces rather than from community. And it kind of goes hand in hand with the work we do then as inclusion trainers. But I suppose we set up this safe place as a non-oppressive therapy centre. We've trained our therapists and continue to train our therapists in inclusion, even though it mightn't be seen as a counselling or psychotherapy issue. So we want our therapy practices to be a safe space that are accessible for everybody. We don't yet have wheelchair access in our therapy centre, but 90% of our therapy is online anyway, and we're actually looking for new premises given the rate at which we've expanded. So hopefully we'll be able to find something within the next 12 to 18 months with wheelchair access.
It's a great answer, and good luck with your future search for new premises. Hope it all goes well for you. And I think the fact that you mentioned there about wheelchair access, we have to ensure that all business premises are fully wheelchair accessible going forward, because if it's not, it's seen as being discriminatory towards people who are wheelchair bound. Moving on to another question for you. What do you think is the future of work for psychotherapists and counsellors?
My spouse is starting psychotherapy training in September, and a friend said to me, "Are you not worried with both of you being in the same industry that you might not be recession-proof in your household?" And I actually see more and more the stigma around needing mental health support slowly and gradually fading. So I feel that it's one of the few professions that is going to be recession-proof regardless of what the future holds. Now, how that looks is up to the individual practice or therapist. But I think the future of work is to be a lot more client-driven and person-centered. I think historically, the idea of therapy was this white coat professional who had a doctorate and potentially a lot of academic power over the client needing support. And I see it a lot more balanced now. Therapists are a lot more open about their own human experience. And I think it's the client's needs that are driving the future of work. It's the client's needs that are shaping how the training is absolutely enhancing and developing and growing. And I'm seeing now as a therapist, I'm on a few committees as a therapist and a few boards, I'm seeing this almost this new type of therapy emerge that is client-driven and person-centered. And it's originally coming from the Rogerian practice of person-centered therapy, but it's great to see that it's becoming non-oppressive, more inclusive. And the only real advantage, I suppose, a therapist would have is that they trained in a particular thing. There's no longer this power dynamic. And I think that makes therapy a lot more accessible and therapists a lot more human. And that would be my hope. The future of work is that it becomes more and more human, where we're all people trying to figure it out together.
I have one final question for you. You grew up in an entrepreneurial household. What effect did that have on you in your life?
It probably put me off the idea of ever being an entrepreneur. I used to say as a kid, I never wanted to be self-employed. And now that I am self-employed, I'm just kicking myself I didn't do it sooner. My parents are both self-employed. A lot of my family are self-employed. My grandfather is self-employed. My grandmother was self-employed. There's an entrepreneurial mindset. I think we are at our core quite creative and just quite strategic thinkers. But I saw how hard my parents worked. I saw that they'd be working late Christmas Eve. I saw that they worked 6 days a week as the norm, sometimes 7. And I saw the financial difficulties in the 80s. Going into the 90s, I saw the financial struggles that my parents had. And I did not want that. I wanted a secure, pensionable 9 to 5 where I'd finish work, come home and knew how much I was getting paid and when. But I was not happy doing that. And now that I've sort of finally caved and taken on the entrepreneurial lifestyle myself, a lot busier. Unfortunately, I don't have a 9 to 5. It's more like a 9 to 9. And again, it's the 6 days a week, but I wouldn't change it for the world. I think when you're doing what you love, And that's the piece I didn't really understand growing up, is how much my family loved what they were doing. And now I get that. But it's funny, it put me off the idea of it, and just, I am kicking myself I didn't do it sooner.
Thank you for that very in-depth and honest answer there, Gillian. So 3 remarkable things I can take away from today's interview is passion. You mentioned it there in the interview, Gillian, that in terms of under the rainbow, yourself and your co-founders, your passion has driven you forward for the past 2 or 3 years. And now you're seeing the result of all the effort and energy you've put into building that business up. Secondly, I think in terms of redundancy, it may seem the most dreadful thing at the time, and I've had that experience myself. But in hindsight, it can be a game changing or a game changer for your life. And both of us here today are doing work that we love to do, as opposed to work we used to do, but we used to question ourselves, why are we doing it? And thirdly, keep focused, keep driving your business ideas forward, keep your client in mind at all times. And you said there today that in terms of psychotherapists and counselors, they're no longer people in white coats. They're people-centric people, and they're there to help their customers, their clients, to build better lives for themselves. Before I let you go, is there something else you'd like to say to the audience, Gillian?
I want to thank you, John, for this opportunity.
You're very welcome.
On a final note, this might seem like a little bit of tough love advice, but if something has to get done, it's up to us to do it. Everybody has a role to play and a part to play in improving their own lives, and therefore, by extension, improving the community and improving the society. If we wait for somebody else to do it, it might never get done, and you'd be surprised at the impact one individual can have. So I just think you matter a lot more than you might think you do. And even as an individual, you can make such a huge impact because of the knock-on effect.
And on that note, I'll bring today's show to an end. Thank you, Gillian.
Thank you.